It is 4 o'clock London time, so I'll go ahead. Thank you very much for joining us to the Asset Owner panel. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Marion Maloney from the Environmental Agency Pension Fund, Lauren Peacock from Scottish Widows, Marlene Timberlake Diadamo from CalPERS, apologies if I mispronounced Marlene, and Ellen Quigley from Jesus College of the University of Cambridge to this asset owner discussion, having followed the asset manager discussion, which already had fantastic insights. I'd like to start with Marlene and Marion from the asset owner perspective, and specifically, I'd like to start with Marlene. I understand that from March 2023 onwards, CalPERS will have new disclosure requirements on emerging and diverse asset managers, and that relates to the newly adopted diversity, equity, and inclusion framework. And I also see on CalPERS website very nice definitions of diversity and inclusion, which I briefly would like to read out if possible. So diversity defined as the inherent and acquired qualities that make us unique as individuals. Inclusion, a practice to maintain a positive environment where all individuals feel recognized and valued. Marlene, would you like to introduce the new framework to us?
Sure. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here. Fantastic panel. I actually caught the last half of the previous one, so that was really interesting as well. So I am the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at CalPERS, and CalPERS is the pension plan for the state of California for the retirees and their beneficiaries. We serve about 2 million individuals with their pension plans, and we also have a health program that has approximately 1.5 million covered lives. So we have a pretty big footprint when it comes to the work that we're doing. And we have we've been involved in measures of diversity and diversity work for some time, particularly on our investment side, where we actually have a set of investment beliefs that specifically look at diversity. And as Andreas mentioned, we are involved in diversity work within, public companies as well as on boards and things like that. Our framework, actually, we started in 2020, I guess, to make a long story short, with the scenery, the situation that occurred in the U.S. in 2020. I was actually asked to take an interim position as the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer to put together a framework. We didn't want to wait, and we wanted to start the work immediately. And so in March, that happened in June of 2020. In March of 2021, we actually rolled out our proposed framework to our board. And as Andreas mentioned, all that information is actually on our website. And our framework is really aimed at making an impact. I think what we've been talking about is where, do the work where you can make an impact. And so for us, we've decided to focus on 5 areas. And our framework is organized in terms of the work that we're going to do, goals, objectives, and initiatives for each of those 5 areas. Our first area is culture. And as everybody knows, if you don't have a good culture, it's probably hard to have a really good organization and certainly a great working environment. So culture is at the top. The next area is talent management. And again, you got to make sure that your team members, we call our employees team members, that your team members are engaged and happy and productive. And so talent management is our second area. Our third area is investments. For those of you who aren't that familiar with CalPERS, we actually have the market's been down this week, but call it approximately 500 billion under management, and we invest those funds in order to pay the pensions for our 2 million members. And so investments is a big part of what we do. And as Andreas mentioned, we have emerging managers, and we have a lot of areas that we do work around in the investment area as well. Our health program is the fourth area, and again mentioned that we have about 1.5 million covered lives that we are paying benefits for. And then the fifth area is supplier diversity. And so I like to say that we spend a boatload of money. And so that's one of those low-hanging fruit, areas where we can definitely make sure that we're improving diversity in that area. So that's our framework.
Thank you very much. Just for everybody, please do not share your video while everybody else is on the panel. And the timing regarding the legislation, Marlene, and please apologize if as an outsider I don't fully understand this. I understand that from March 2023 there is an additional California legislation on diverging and emerging and diverse managers, and that relates to your framework, or did I misunderstand that from the media coverage?
So the California legislature has, over the last, call it, I might get the numbers wrong, but call it 5 to 10 years, maybe more, has been very interested in emerging managers. And so we actually have a requirement to do reporting on emerging managers. So I think that's what you're talking about, is the reporting that we do on our emerging manager program.
Okay, perfect. Can we ask everybody who is not speaking to switch off the camera? That would be excellent. Coming to ask Marion. Marion, we've seen the Asset Owner Diversity Charter coming in Europe. Are you looking forward to the results? Helen has presented the results to us already. How do you feel about it from an EAPF perspective?
Yeah, thank you. Marlene mentioned about how she had, I wrote down the figure, $500 billion. Well, in our funds, I work for the Environment Agency Pension Fund. We only have about, in dollars, probably about $6 billion. So not a huge amount, but there has been a big focus on what we can do with that. And we've been banging on about lots of things for quite a number of years, and about gender issues throughout the last 5 years, firing off letters left, right, and centre. So in terms of how you feel about it, Andreas, to answer your question, yeah, I think it's a really exciting moment. I mean, when I look at what we've done as a fund, as ahead of this meeting this afternoon, I asked somebody in my team to go away and look at how you voted last year. Now, through Helen's work primarily, Brunel, through this kind of diversity focus, we've got some cracking voting guidelines. I want to look to them in terms of, right, okay, if you've got women or men less than 33% on the board in FTSE 350 company, you know, we should be voting against these companies. And so we've got criteria about where we vote in relation to diversity. And when I look at the figures from last year alone, you know, we're voting against lots of companies that are just not doing enough in relation to gender and in relation to broader diversity issues, which I'm really proud of as a fund. And when I looked at it all, kind of how it broke down, some really interesting stuff around gender and how actually was focused on certain countries and ethnicity on some other countries that weren't doing enough. I'm not going to say what they are because it's not statistically robust. I mean, you know, if you're a PhD student out there or a journalist, you could be taking that contest. But the point is, you know, there's trends here about stuff that we could be developing. So as an asset owner, what is our power? We've got to use our vote wisely. We've got to use our asset managers wisely. We've got asset managers that should be representing our views and should be engaging with companies on that. We've got stuff around collective initiatives we can get involved with as investors. So we talked about diversity charter. In fact, for the diversity charter, what we did, we took it in-house this year and we engaged with our members from a Black, Asian, minority ethnic background, and we looked at actually this is what we can learn from the industry, the financial industry, you know, what they're doing around diversity. Can we bring that in-house? What do we have in terms of the Environment Agency, in terms of, you know, what we can share with other actors across this? So I think there's shed loads that asset owners could do. Now, a couple of things. One is around challenges and one is around why I'm hopeful. The challenges are our sphere of influence is governed by where we hold those shares. And, you know, and it might be that in some parts of the world, our vote has more influence than others. It depends on those national governments and what they're doing around the policy framework to help, for example, around disclosure of information. So, for example, in the UK, when they introduced the pay gap and companies having to disclose on that, that led to us then biting into lots of companies saying, look, hang on, you know, this pay gap's atrocious. What are you doing about it? Another challenge, though, for us as a team is the resources. You know, as a small fund, we focus a lot on certain primarily environmental ESG issues. Diversity is one where, you know, where we work with others externally. We can't use that as a focus internally, but it's something that we think more broadly should be one of our priorities. But I can understand why other smaller funds out there trying to cover all of these really key, important ESG issues is a problem. And then the final challenge I'd say is actually it's really difficult. Even if looking at our fund in terms of our gender and our racial diversity, and also more broadly in terms of the Environment Agency itself, really fantastic initiatives internally to support women going through their working life. But it's still really difficult. If I look at the stats around management and in terms of the top tier of executive managers, really healthy to a certain point and then naturally drops off. And all those sorts of things that we're trying to implement internally are exactly the sort of things that our investee companies are doing well, and that we have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. Now, I'll finish, Andreas, by saying why I'm hopeful. This is why I'm hopeful. One is I think the focus on ESG is only going in one direction. And I think, in the UK, we have this thing called Stewardship Code where we have to show that what we're doing is making a difference. Stats around diversity and gender is generally disclosable and generally is something that you can report on. And I think there will be a lot more focus on this and other funds who need to show they're making a difference. And this is something that they can grab and run with. Two is, it's not just about me as an institutional investor. The retail investors are out there, and things I think are starting to change around shareholder democracy. I read something in an article yesterday which was saying that even just retail investors alone, the amount of participation in votes has gone up by 110% over the last year. For me, there's something underway, and that links to my final point, which is, as investors, we're going to be held more accountable for how we invest. And part of that is about what we're doing with our votes. We're seeing this certainly in the UK through shareholder action in terms of what we are doing and how we're using our vote to drive positive change. And absolutely, gender diversity and a more diverse broad workforce and boards across the board are absolutely part of that.
Marion, that's fantastic. Let me just ask one clarification question. You said with your own managers, it was healthy up to a certain point and then it drops off. And I assume that you're looking upwards in terms of seniority, so it drops off at the more senior.
So this is within the environment issue itself. Yes, Andreas. So you're looking about kind of middle 40% in terms of executive managers. And then when you get to the top quartile of managers, it goes down to about 35%. I think it's still far healthier than where it was maybe even 5 years ago. Huge amount of initiatives internally to drive that change. But still, it's it needs to be higher. I'm looking for parity. And when we're looking at those voting guidelines, then we have as a fund, that's also looking at it as an executive, what we want in terms of percentages on the executive committees of these boards, of these companies, but also in terms of the boards themselves, in terms of directors of the boards, we want them as well. So I think it's helpful to distinguish between, the executive managers and the directors.
And just another clarification question. When you vote against the boards for elective diversity, although probably not necessarily zero diversity, right? You voted everyone on the board. You vote against the man and the woman on the board, right? Yes. And so equally, those voting guidelines, it's not just about only 33% of women on the board. If there's only 33%, if there's no men on the board, that's also an issue around diversity. I think it's got to, diversity is about a number of issues, but it's, it's not just about. I serve as VP Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion here at the college. We do look at, of course, diversity both ways around, and there can be degrees like midwifery, but it's another part of diversity. So you said it's extremely challenging. Do you want to give us your top one challenge, and then I'll ask Marlene for her top one challenge?
Yeah, I think for me, as a little fund, it's about being on top of this in terms of. Sorry, did you ask me, Andreas? Was that to me? Or did you ask me something else?
First, and then I just ask her later to give her time to prepare.
I think it's me as a little fund being on top of all these issues, which is why I think on some issues we naturally have to, kind of leave it to other people to learn to act on behalf on these issues. I think as the Environment Pension Fund, we naturally have a huge focus on climate change and some other environmental issues. But gender is still important and still important to our members. So it's something that, we have to make sure we've got that right balance between doing really effective stuff on, but being aware we can't do everything ourselves. We need help on this issue too.
Okay, Marlene, as a much bigger fund, what do you consider the number one challenge?
It's interesting. Thank you. I was listening to Marion's answer and thinking about it as a big fund. I would say, our biggest challenge is that we have the what's the word I want to use? We sort of have the engagement, but the area is so bifurcated, I guess I'll say, fractioned, if you will, that it's really about making sure that we're threading the needle in all of the places that we think are appropriate in order to see the change that we want to see. We have efforts going on, as you mentioned, in financial area, we have efforts on board diversity, we have efforts on portfolio companies. So we have a lot of efforts underway, initiatives, if you will, in a lot of different areas. And it's really about making sure that we're tying all those things together so that we're having the impact that we want to have.
That's excellent. I do actually use some of your engagement slides in my teaching, so I very much enjoy them.
Right.
Moving to Ellen and Lauren, and Ellen is Sustainable Finance Lead for Jesus College, but her PhD actually was on cognitive diversity and how you think as an economist. So I'll start with you, Ellen, and especially considering the definition I think that the CalPERS puts forward of inclusion, so a positive environment where everyone feels recognized and valued. If everyone just has one background, do you think we can shape that positive environment, or do we need different backgrounds and openness? You're still muted.
Yeah, classic. So I mean it is a question I always like to answer, because there is a very clear line of inquiry here, that was a surprising one for economists and also finance education. You tend to see not just self-selection into studying those topics, but then what's called an indoctrination effect. So people start to think more similarly as they go along, and it's quite significant. This is going to sound hyperbolic, but I swear it's true. If you take even a semester of economics, you are more likely to behave differently under experimental scenarios, and that's very strange, and that applies across diverse groups of people. So I think we do need diversity of all kinds, because you can end up in a situation in which, because of the training people have had, especially around the assumptions that are built into economics and finance education, things like agency theory, homo economicus, ways in which people are basically taught that humans can't be trusted, or that humans are more self-interested and less governed by social norms than they in fact are, then you can start to see kind of perverse outcomes, even if you have some diversity metrics that look good in other ways. So I don't think that should detract from those other efforts at all. It's just, it is a really important element to bring in addition.
Absolutely. And Lauren, I think your work focuses on cognitive diversity at Scottish Widows.
Yes, hi everyone. So I work in the stewardship team under the responsible investment team, and there's a little bit of background about Scottish Widows first and how it fits in. So we have about 170 billion in assets and about 6 million customers, but we don't actually manage any assets internally. We work through asset managers. So kind of similar to Marion, that actually it's not just our direct engagement with companies, but we really have to engage with our asset managers for them to engage on our behalf as well. Yeah, we chose cognitive diversity as we feel that representation is essential. You should have businesses that reflect society, and that's really important. But we actually wanted to go further than that. We want more perspectives, more backgrounds. And I think a kind of example of it is, so I was just doing a little Google search before this call about, there's a lot of controversy at the moment about the big manufacturers and the vaccines that they're making and not, supplying to developing countries, etc. And I just thought I'd look at the boards of those companies and who sat on them. And I thought it was interesting, and it's not necessarily positive or negative either way, but AstraZeneca had 3 board members who had worked as frontline doctors, whereas Moderna had no one I could see on the board of directors who'd had a kind of doctor medicine background, and I thought that was quite interesting. And when we're thinking about cognitive diversity, we're thinking about, okay, so we want a diverse board, but why do we want a diverse board? In addition to representation, we want a diverse board because we want that board to be making the right decisions and to be really thinking about their products and how they affect communities and stakeholders and society. And therefore, you want people on boards who are going to really challenge, for profit, short-termism. You want people who are really going to think about how the products and services are affecting communities. And therefore, you want to bring people in who have really different perspectives. So, for example, doctors should be on boards of pharmaceutical companies. Farmers should be on boards of grocery companies. And we should have people on fashion companies who have worked in supply chains and in countries that actually manufacture the clothes. So our focus is just really making that diversity wider and making it work harder.
That sounds very good. And in the UK, Spencer Stewart put forward a study that Helen also mentioned in her keynote, that for the first time now, the majority of women in the majority of non-executive directors are actually women. But then when you look at the executive directors, is a ratio of 1 to 9. So when you're looking at the board work, and there was 1 female, 9 male, when you're looking at the board work, do you also consider the power in the position between executives, non-executives, different roles on the board, and so forth?
Definitely. So I think, I mean, there's a reason that it's diversity and inclusion, isn't there? Because that inclusion bit, what the culture we were just spoken about before, is so key. And in our research, we found that the chair was really key. So the fact that the chair brought in those, because you can bring people on who have different perspectives, but if they're not incorporated and felt, made to feel really comfortable, then it defeats the object. And whatever that dynamic is, whether it's executive versus non-executive, you've got to really be aware of that as the chair of that group and manage it, and allow people to be them true selves and bring their different perspectives.
And now the same question that previously to Marion and Marlene, first to you, then to Ellen. What's the biggest challenge in your work?
So I would say maybe the data, actually. I think, we have some data in some markets, but really, we were talking about voting before. I mean, we don't have our voting guidelines yet. We're putting them out this year, which is very exciting. But, actually building those up so it's really robust, and you can say, okay, these companies aren't meeting these targets. You need to have the data there to do it, because if no one's publishing any data, then how do you engage meaningfully and how do you make those voting decisions? So I think it's good, there's the likes of the Workforce Disclosure Initiative and really good work going on to improve it. But in terms of across markets, and that, the data piece to make informed decisions is really key.
That makes perfect sense to me. Ellen, what's the biggest challenge in your perspective?
Well, I'm in persuasion mode much of the time in my role. So I'm going to kind of take it from that perspective. I think what I would like to be able to convince large asset owners in particular, because of the power that they hold in the system, is that this is a systemic issue. In that, I mean, if you look at some of the stats around labor productivity and GDP growth and so on and so forth, we're all kind of chasing the 50s and 60s. And guess what happened then? You had a lot more women and a lot more people of color come into the workplace for the first time sometimes, in higher paying roles, more skilled roles, etc. That's what can happen in an economy that actually makes good use of its people. And if you look at the unemployment rate among, say, people with disabilities, and so on and so forth, I mean, we're missing a trick. So if asset owners can start to think of it more as a systemic issue, something that is important to every element of the economy and therefore their whole portfolio. And again, I'm sorry to always bring up universal ownership in whatever panel I'm on, but to really truly view this as a universal ownership challenge. So that seems like a big element there. And if you have that attitude then and want to make systemic change, then you have to use the most effective tactics available to you, which I'm coming to the view are voting against directors, but not just to make the board more diverse, by the way, but also to make the executive teams and so on more diverse, as has been alluded to. But also to deny debt to companies that really aren't addressing this issue on the timescale that's required. Because again, if you view this as a systemic issue that affects everything, not just the people whose lives are affected, which is already enough reason to act, but because we're missing a trick at that macro level, then you should be using the most effective tactics. And this is why I do sometimes, frankly, get frustrated hearing about a lot of work on just disclosure or kind of what Raj Thammatharam views as tummy tickling engagement and so on and so forth. Because I think if you do view it as a systemic issue, you should be as ambitious and effective in your work as possible. So that's what I hope to persuade asset owners to do, even though I don't have that power myself.
So to directly ask a question then, so we see SDG-linked bonds now starting to flourish heavily. So not a green bond where specific activity is financed, but general financing with SDG conditions, effectively ESG covenants, as I would call it academically. And having done research on them, some of these SDG-linked bonds have 7 different KPIs, and they weigh them accordingly. So they're not necessarily single issue KPIs. The original SDG-linked bond was from Enel just on climate change. But if you, for instance, gave an SDG-linked refinancing for 10 years, would you not be able then just to require 30% gender diversity or 33% or 40% among top executives or among the board? Is that something you'll be talking about?
Should I answer, Andreas?
Yeah, it was for you, sorry.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I would love that. I'm frankly too cynical to expect that that would be a covenant that would make it into an actual company's. Yeah, I think there would be resistance on the part of the company itself to do that. When I look at transition-linked bonds, green bonds, SDG-linked bonds, usually the targets are things that are very easily achievable. So unless the company felt that they were already fairly close to that goal, I sort of doubt that they would voluntarily take that on. But as your work shows us, Andreas, there's a lot of power in the hands of debt holders, purchasers of debt, and therefore they could probably negotiate for something like that. And it is kind of hard to argue against, because more diverse boards make better decisions. You know, having more diverse leadership teams, you know, improves the returns of the company. Like, it makes sense for investors and anyone else who cares about the long-term health of the company. So yeah, I think there would be a lot of reasons to push for that. I'm just somewhat cynical that it would happen.
I will look it up. There's over 300 SDG bonds. I don't have everyone in my mind, but they have up to 7 SDGs, and I believe diversity is at least among them, but probably at board level, where it's of course much easier. And Marlene, when you're looking at the fixed income side of your work, are you engaging there with issuers? I don't know how big your fixed income portfolio is, so if I misrepresent this, but how do you think about that?
So we are looking to bring elements of diversity, equity, and inclusion into all areas of our investments. We have several asset classes. Fixed income, of course, is a big one for us. And I would say that we are looking at ways that we can bring that in. So, you know, the work here on the CalPERS side, the diversity work has, as I've mentioned, has been underway for a long time. We do things, I want to sort of refer to what the previous speakers have talked about, is we have share owner campaigns. We vote against directors, particularly when there aren't elements of diversity. We engage with companies, and we do lots of things with organizations to make sure that they hear us as an asset owner regarding what we think diversity means. As you've indicated, we have very broad definitions and very inclusive definitions, because we don't want to necessarily limit, you know, the elements. I think, as someone previously mentioned, it's, you know, we look at all areas of diversity, not just one or two elements. And so I would say that, you know, we do bring those elements into all areas of our investments, and we're looking specifically at being more targeted, I guess I would say, or maybe more specific in terms of that, with areas like our fixed income investing and others. Private equity is another big one.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. So do you have any examples on the fixed income or private equity side you want to share with us?
Well, I mean, what I could talk about would be, it wouldn't be specific, because we don't talk about specifics. But sure. I guess what I would say is the conversations that we have, we engage with companies, and we actually, I think one of the things that maybe folks don't know about us is that we actually have addressed questions around not being able to find diverse individuals by creating a database called 3D. It's a diverse director database. And so we actually have utilized a database that has, I'm not sure what the number is, but, you know, several hundred individuals that are in this database to answer a question of, well, we can't find diverse people. And we created this database in partnership with other, with CalSTRS actually, and, you know, are trying to solve those kind of problems, really.
So you've actually already taken excuses away from the companies that they might return to you. That sounds fantastic. So
it's solving problems. Yes.
And Marion, from your perspective at the Environmental Agency Pension Fund, I don't know if you have any direct fixed income mandates, but following on Alan's.
Yeah, we don't. What you said earlier about denying debt, I mean, for us as a fund, it's quite interesting because I never thought about it, to be honest, in relation to gender diversity. We have a policy of denying debt in relation to climate change, if there isn't a climate change covenant in place, but not in relation to gender diversity. And it's a challenge I'll take back. Why not? Why haven't we thought about this? But I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier in terms of, as a little fund, what are our priorities? And we've got priorities for engagement and climate change is top of ours, but actually on the gender side, could we do more around that? But broadly speaking, our asset managers in the area of fixed income, absolutely, yeah, we'd be expecting them to engage on these issues. And I haven't got specific examples for you, but I've seen lots of their glossy, publications which they show that they're doing work in this area. So yeah, absolutely. I think that issue around asset classes, and it's not just fixed income, it's not just listed equity. Private markets is another one. I think we have. I think through our asset managers, I think you probably have more exposure to the board and be able to bring about change in those areas too, in terms of what we want to be seeing in relation to good governance. So yeah, absolutely. I think it's right across the board, right across asset classes, and it's not just about the votes.
Yeah, any primary market seems where fresh cash is flowing into a company seems highly relevant, and having like I said, SDG-linked bonds are a big trend over the last 2.5 years since they were launched, and looking at them, some have up to 7 SDGs. And while Ellen might be rightfully saying that some will take the board level, not the top executive, as a gender diversity, but I do believe to recall that there is some diversity KPIs in some of these. Of course, it's a small case. And then also, of course, going to Lauren. So when you look at, let's maybe say not fixed income specifically, but primary markets, do you engage on diversity in primary markets, fixed income or private equity?
So most of our direct work is on public equity, but when we're engaging our asset managers, it's trying to get them actually to give us examples. Because I think it's still, we've been talking about stewardship in fixed income for a while, but I don't feel like the examples are necessarily there. And often we're asking our asset managers about the relationship between the equity and the fixed income as well. So often they hold both. And does that change the engagement? Or when you just hold fixed income, well, what is your escalation strategy? I think that's the key thing. In the debt point is a really good one, but how else do you take it? Or if you have public equity in the same company, do you then vote against the company? So I think we've been trying to explore that through our asset managers and get more information from them, because I agree it's a big proportion of asset allocation. So.
We have been starting to get questions from the audience, so I'll straight away bring the audience. And Deborah Gilshin is asking the following. I really support Ellen's view about diversity and inclusion as a systemic issue and the need for the universal loan approach. Please, could Ellen explain how we can frame diversity and inclusion as a systemic opportunity in a better way, as I think this is the key to progress?
I love that question, obviously. So I actually think probably academics could actually be useful for once here and compile some of the data that we know are available on the benefits to inclusion, to expanding employment bases to a broader group of people, and the benefit that brings to a whole economy. And I think that work needs to be done. I mean, there was a report put out, I'm forgetting which bank put this out a couple of years ago. It estimated that there were basically trillions in lost returns because of racism. And equally, you've got that historical example, especially on gender. It's very, very clear that there's no way that we would have seen the kind of unprecedented economic boom after World War II had it not been for especially the tremendous influx of women into the workforce. So I think we should probably basically package that more compellingly. We have the information. It is just true if you have people who are, if you have the best people in the roles that are most important, and you're making best use of everyone in your economy, the logical conclusion is that will make things better for everyone, except for maybe some white males who are currently in a position that they might not otherwise have. But even then, they would be there, they would benefit from an overall healthier economy, and that's the kind of systemic point. So I think it really is a compilation of what we actually do already know that's most likely to be helpful there. But yeah, thanks for the question. It's a great one.
So in essence, just framing it and repeating it to an extent, maybe, Alan, and then moving forward. And any further questions, of course, from the audience are very welcome. I'll move over to Marlene. Marlene, there's a lot of calls say that the climate debate would be a lot better if there was more diverse decision making. And so do you see diversity and inclusion related to the big climate change challenge we're facing? And at the moment in Europe, we're even facing a greenwashing challenge with our green taxonomy.
So I didn't hear the last part of your question.
And we're currently in Europe facing a challenge in political will on climate change, but that was maybe just an anecdote. So just generally speaking, do you see a link between diversity, gender diversity, ethnic diversity, and climate change, both in terms of solving it as well as potentially in terms of exposure?
Yeah, so we actually have a sustainable investments program, and the group that runs that is looking at, they're involved in climate. I mean, as many of you probably know, we're involved in a lot of big policy issues around climate, around water. We participate in a lot of broad efforts towards engagement around these issues. And we actually view the climate, the ESG issues, and the diversity as related in the sense of, both are broad issues that need to be dealt with. I like the term as a systemic opportunity. We actually look at the lack of diversity and the lack of DEI as risks that organizations have. And so we are working really hard to bring those two areas together to make sure that the decisions that get made related to climate particularly, or ESG broadly, also include those diversity measures, because of what was said previously about what happens when you have diverse groups making decisions. You just get better decisions. And I don't think, to pile on a little bit for the previous question that was asked about how you can bring this in a way, frame it, I think is you just have to get more people to see the data. And someone had mentioned earlier about data being a big issue. That really is a big issue, is getting everybody to be on the same page so that the data can be interpreted in a way that folks can actually take action. Right now, it's a bit scattered. And so with the fact that it's scattered, there really is room, what I call daylight, essentially, for folks to maybe have to not be on board as much, or to not see it as clearly as some others see it. And so I think the effort really is about bringing that data together, bringing folks together, and really enabling folks to move in a positive direction without, like I said, the daylight that tends to occur for, things that folks maybe aren't totally on board with.
Andreas, can I come in there as well, please? I mean, sure. In relation to that issue around climate, which I think is a really interesting one, there's always this quote from a fantastic female leader, Mary Robinson, that climate change is a man-made problem that requires a feminist solution. Now, I was lucky enough to go along to COP, and what I do with my girls, I indoctrinate my girls, I freely admit, and they're the ones that are saying to me, Mom, you should give boys a chance. So before I went to COP, I want to give boys a chance. And actually, I met Mary Robinson, and I was just over the moon by the fact that I met this woman. And I came back full of, I'm gonna save the world, and I'm gonna do all this stuff in my free time. And through a whole route of events, I won't bore you with it, but I got involved with a community group, and in it there was somebody from the church, from a Catholic church recently. And what I find really amazing is that not just in the world of finance, where the ESG agenda is generally female-led, but actually, in the communities, it's also female-led. And even I've discovered in the Catholic Church, this need to address climate change is led by females within the Catholic Church even. So that's what I find really exciting about this agenda. The first time I turned up, I came from an industry perspective. I wasn't in finance 3 years ago. And when I came to my first conference in London, the City of London, I expected to see shed loads of pinstripes. It was predominantly female. And I met somebody who said to me, actually, it's the nice end of the city. That's how they described it. And I think they're right. This ESG world is female-led. And, yeah, that's been my experience to date. And I think, fantastic, let's go with it. Let's take on Mary's mantle. Yeah.
This is a fantastic quote. The Catholic Church, that's a really surprising fact to me, has a female-led climate campaign.
So it's through a local church that I've got involved with this community group, and it happens to be led by a female, but they put me on to watch this video. And actually it's all about, it's a whole host of churches that are interested in this, but even within the Catholic Church, she explained to me that it's female-led, the thinking around why the church needs to take steps on this issue. So yeah, that's breaking news. Is that a headline then, Andreas? Are we just giving
for me, yes, definitely headline. And I might do some research on that.
I shall send you the videos, Andreas. Yeah.
Please do, yes. Ellen, I see you're showing.
Yeah, I have to emphatically agree. I think there is a lot more leadership from women in the ESG space, and that it is a great space to work. I don't know if it's entirely because of that, but it is the nice end of the city. I think it is still lacking in diversity in other ways, though, and that's something that I think we need to very consciously work on. And I just wanted to come back to, I really love this conversation about climate and diversity, because I think one of the things that has really struck me is around fossil fuel infrastructure and environmental racism. And if you're really concerned about the construction of new fossil fuel infrastructure that is going to lock in future emissions, you should be working in solidarity with communities of predominantly communities of color, who are the ones that are going to be directly affected by that infrastructure. And that's overwhelming. The studies on this are absolutely wild. It's so disturbing to see. But that's where the rubber hits the road, really. So I think having this standpoint of taking into account all of these different factors can really help us actually be more strategic, more effective, and a lot fairer and more inclusive in the way that we work.
And then fossil fuel infrastructure and environmental racism, that's what you said, right?
Yeah.
Can you explain it a little bit more with an example or so for the audience?
Sure. Yeah. So if you just looked, if you were to take a map of the United States, I'm Canadian, so I'm outside of this, but we have similar issues, honestly, but it's just with First Nations people instead. But if you were to take a map of the United States and where all of the coal plants are, it maps almost perfectly onto communities that live in poverty and communities of color. And you do not find a rich white neighborhood with a coal plant in it. That just doesn't happen. And if it were to be proposed, it would be successfully opposed. So it's one of the most, I don't think that you could make an argument that there isn't real racism when you look at those maps and how closely they overlap. It is striking, and that's true even in Europe. There's been some studies here as well, because of the particulate matter, the effect on air pollution and so on and so forth. It is only poor communities and or communities of color who end up dealing with it.
That sounds most likely very true and very stunning as well. Lauren, from your perspective at Scottish Widows, how do you feel you want to systemically use the opportunities going forward? What would be the best thing that could happen in the next 5 years?
I really like the whole systemic way of viewing things. I feel when we were doing our report on cognitive diversity, we had to do the business case, and I think that's really key. But at the same time, we don't have to. No one ever asks to prove why white middle class men are being so successful and, you know, gaining profits. I don't think we shouldn't have to make an argument for why women will receive higher profits. That's not the kind of point on an individual company basis. It's about like kind of overall better decisions, better, you know, groups, better discussion, and thinking about all these broader things. I love that point, Ellen, about this is, yeah, there's kind of communities and societies. In terms of opportunity, specifically on diversity, I think it's quite a tricky one actually, because I think we mainly see it as risk as well, because it does feel like you're not thinking about diversity. You know, where are you? Like, it's 2022. Like you're just missing out on so much knowledge and so many perspectives. So I think we mainly see it from a risk perspective rather than opportunity. But I guess the opportunities come through naturally as the risks are managed well.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Can I maybe briefly, and then we have further audience questions, ask the other three panelists, do you see it more as a risk, as an opportunity, or more balanced? Maybe Marion.
Did you say Marlene or Marion?
Marion, I said, sorry.
I said, yeah, I'm the same. We see it as primarily a risk opportunity. Yeah. Sorry, risk rather than opportunity. Yeah, we see.
Malene, you previously said that a lack of diversity would certainly be a risk. Do you also see it primarily as a risk, or?
Yes, we view the lack of diversity as a risk that needs to be addressed within an organization. The opportunity, I guess, if I can maybe balance the answer, the opportunity, of course, is in helping organizations, you know, improve and increase an element of their productivity. We do believe that diversity leads to better outcomes. And so as a long-term investor, and I don't think I've mentioned that, but we are definitely a long-term investor. We are interested in every opportunity, everything that we can do to help an organization achieve the outcomes that we expect them and need them to achieve so that we can continue to pay pensions far into the future.
And when you say long-term, Malene, is that a 20, 30, 10-year time frame? Do you have a
100-year time frame?
Yeah,
I mean, we're like super long-term investors. We're like Warren Buffett long-term investors, because, you know, we have you know, thousands or tens of thousands of folks coming into the system every year, and folks will work, you know, 20, 30, 40 years, and then they'll get pensions for 20, 30 years, maybe 40 years. So so we definitely think in the long term.
That's a fantastic answer, 100-year time frame. I've spoken to many asset owners. No one has given me the 100 years. I'll definitely remember that. Ellen, more of a risk or more of an opportunity, or mixed?
I love the 100-year time frame as well. That makes my heart glad. Yes, I think, of course, view it as both a risk and an opportunity, but I guess I'd like to use an example as well of ways in which there are unexpected benefits when we take these sorts of things into account. In urban planning, people talk a lot about how if you make something accessible for one group, it ends up making it easier for everyone else. So let's say that you do curb cuts for people in wheelchairs. That also helps anybody with mobility issues, including parents with strollers, and so on and so forth. You know, we think that we're doing something because it'll benefit a narrow group of people, and actually the benefits are a lot more diffuse. And I think we can think about how that would apply in a whole bunch of different elements to do with diversity. And I think that's where you can actually get a real positive out of it, while at the same time, of course, it is a major risk, both company specific and systemic.
So we have a complex question here from the audience, so I look for volunteers. I'm reading it out. So it's great to hear that a lot of ESG and DEI efforts are being made, especially from a climate action perspective. But how can this importance be pushed into other markets or other regions of the world without, and that's the complex bit, it coming across as maybe colonial? Anyone willing to pick up that question?
I would just say that, we try to lead by example. We, over our, 85-year history have employed several methods. I think Ellen used the word persuasion mode earlier. We've been, I guess I would say persuasive, as well as maybe encouraging, as well as maybe even demanding at times. And I think that for us, what works, I think, better than other things is to continue with our engagement efforts, but then to also set an example. And that's one of the things that we're doing with our DEI framework is we're actually putting forward a framework. We're doing the activities. We're super transparent. And we hope that by setting that example and showing how it works and what can actually happen, the benefits, as somebody had mentioned earlier, that can inure to the efforts, folks will get on board. And, we're not naive, but, I think that it is certainly a way to help those that are, more on the positive side than those that aren't. And then there's other things that you do to help nudge those who maybe aren't there yet.
That makes perfect sense. Sorry.
Can I say, Andreas, please? Because I think this question is a really important one, because I think often this world of ESG is seen from a Western perspective. I suppose I would look at findings. There's a government report from the Financial Reporting Council in the UK over the last year, and they looked at, why was this important from a business perspective? And the sorts of things it came out with was around, obviously, we've mentioned before about better decision making. It showed a better financial performance with more diversity. It showed that those companies were less likely to be to get shareholder dissent, so it's better for the company. But there was some, especially more collaboration, more consensus, so kind of all these things that we know bring benefits, which is why as investors we're doing it. So it's not a sort of a moral imperative. And I'm not saying kind of a hard business imperative, but we think actually it is better for business. And there was something in there as well, and it made me chuckle when I read the line. And he said to reduce overconfidence about the board's problem-solving skills, so, i.e., all these boards are made up just of men, think they're really great at solving problems. And do you know what it made me think of? For anybody in there, out there who knows Grayson Perry, he's a British artist. He went along to the City of London a few years ago, and he did a programme about the culture in London, which at the time he found was very male. And he coined I think he was on the coin the phrase toxic masculinity, and I just think it's better for business. So I think if you look at it, the reason we're doing this because we think actually the companies are better managed, if we have this diverse opinion and more collaboration and more consensus decision making. So yeah, but I completely understand that there's cultural issues there too that we need to overcome, but hopefully, the experience that we can share is a positive one.
That makes also very perfect sense. So we had discussed that it might be, we could bring diversity into SDG bonds, and Marlene has highlighted we need much better data. There's still very much a data issue. A further contribution from the audience points us to a publication of the 100% Club, which is also in the chat. And I would read out the actual opening quote and follow up with a question on that. So the opening quote is from Professor Catherine Phillips. The reality is that there is a power in the status quo that motivates the desire for proof of the business case for diversity. Followed up by saying, we all see homogeneity as the norm, which perhaps gives it, the homogeneity, more power than it deserves. And so my question, after years of diversity campaigning, do you still feel you have to prove the business case? Or do you feel we're beyond that and the case, certainly on the risk management side, is so obvious that to run a diversity initiative, it doesn't need yet another proof of the business case? I know academics are still debating it heavily. I see it on LinkedIn all the time with a variety of different performance measures. But do you feel that business case still needs to be made, or are we having a general acceptance that diversity is good risk management? Anyone wants to start?
Yeah, I'm willing to start, Andreas, because I referred to that government report, which was actually with data from the London Business School, and that showed very clearly a better financial performance. So, you know, I think there's nothing for me, it's a bit of a no-brainer. So I'm quite happy to rely on data like that to support my approach. I suppose I would say that as a feminist, but yeah.
We believe the business case has been proved.
Excellent, short and precise answer. But that's it, right? That's it. Lauren.
Yeah, I really like the question. I feel like we're past it, but then at the same time, like personally, I don't. I've kind of said it before. I don't really like talking about the business case because I just feel like it's exactly what that quote is saying. It's trying to prove something which, you know, we're over. We've already shown, and it kind of slows everything down. But then equally, Tucker Ellen talked about persuasion before. Often the people you're trying to persuade, that's the way they think, and therefore you have to talk in that way. But I think we can learn so much from the climate campaigning over the years when it comes to diversity. So I think, you know, we spent so long on climate trying to prove the financial case. I mean, especially in the pensions world, it said, you know, it's the financial risk, this is why you have to take it into account. But, you know, actually, for me, it's not about those short-term financial risks. It's about we literally won't have a world for people to live on if we don't do something about that. And that's harder to get across and, you know, harder to explain to people, but that's the truth. So I think it's a kind of balance for me between, there's a little bit of business case, I don't think it's going to go anywhere, but that we kind of partner that with actually, there's the bigger picture here as well that we need to think about. It's not just the business case, it's the world and our livelihoods and everything else.
That sounds very good to me. That also were the questions we had from the audience. So first of all, thank you very much all for an excellent panel. And now I'd like to give all of you 1 minute exactly per speaker for a closing statement, and we'll go in reverse alphabetical order as we started. So Ellen, maybe first.
Okay, well, I think instead of summarizing, which I would normally use the time to talk about systemic risks and environmental racism and so on and so forth, these very good reasons we should act on this. I think that there's also some really interesting things have come out here in terms of the ways in which we can learn from climate activism and so on and so forth. But I think we should have that balanced view, right? We've known for a long time. Everyone on this call seems to think that we have reached the point at which it's agreed now that the business case has been made. But that's been true for a while, and it took you know, a lot of some of the biggest protests in the world last year to finally realize that and it was an emotional thing. It was the murder of somebody that got people worked up to the point at which they were willing to actually take action, sometimes for the first time, even though apparently they must have known that there was this business case, but there was this moral impetus that came from the death of George Floyd that allowed that to kind of connect with what people understand at some instinctive level is what's morally right. So I think we do need to kind of make best use of the data, make best use of those arguments, but also not lose sight of social norms and kind of moral imperatives as well, because the combination is likely to be more effective than either in isolation.
Marlene, can I give the word to you for a 1 minute closing?
Sure. I guess first thing I would say is watch what we do. We have been heavily engaged in this area for a while and have redoubled our efforts, if you will, in the last couple of years. And so we're really going to be, you know, in the forefront. And then the other thing I would add is that the elements and the work that we're doing, I think what we don't necessarily understand is all of the different impacts and ways that you know, diversity, equity, inclusion, racism impacts other people. I think folks think that, oh, it's possibly something that affects a group, say a group like what was talked about in terms of environmental racism. But when you think about all of the impacts and the direct and indirect impacts, what you see is that if these things aren't addressed, they really infect a lot of systems. They impact, you know, populations that either are directly and are even indirectly involved. And I think what the events of last year have done is they've really raised that awareness level for people that this is not just something that affects a particular group of people, but it really affects all people in a lot of different ways, and some very, very harmful ways. And so we're going to be, like I said, redoubling our efforts to make sure that we're part of that conversation.
Thank you very much. Lauren, your final word.
I was just wanting to kind of say something that we found in our research last year, which was on cognitive diversity on boards, and kind of board recruiters and board members kind of said that, you know, we've widened the pool somewhat when it comes to recruiting for boards, but it's not changed, it's just slightly expanded. And I think really we just need to push to really widen and change that pool of people that we're recruiting. And I love that we've got a list of directors that are diverse. That's so cool. So I'm excited to for kind of projects like that, which are just solutions.
Great. So the Director Diversity database from CalPERS can certainly very much help there. Marion, your final.
Yeah, my final thought is that actually I really think people are waking up to the power of money, and the power not just of regulation but of money to drive positive change. And I mentioned before about shareholder democracy, but these platforms allowing people to vote on shareholder resolutions are only in one direction, and I just think it's really exciting, and I think companies will be made to look at this, and as will asset owners, which is
Excellent.
great.
Thank you very much. A very positive closing. So thanks very much to an excellent panel. I applaud. And I'll hand back to Scott with 1 minute delay. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. That was fantastic.